Our last progression is borrowed from Joe Henderson's Isotope, and it departs from the previous progressions in a significant way. Let me play the progression. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. So let me unpack that progression that is completely different from what we've encountered thus far. So first of all, there are some interesting, let me start at the end with the turnaround progression. Our typical turnaround progression that we've encountered so far was based on a 3, 6 to 5 progression. 3, 6 to 5. Then we've talked about ways to change the quality of the underlying chords. Instead of minor, we can have dominant, 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 dominant. Here is something very interesting. When you examine the root motion of the turnaround, it forms a symmetrical progression. It forms a minor third cycle. And Henderson basically uses the same chord qualities using that symmetrical progression. So the kind of, there's a technical term for that progression, equal division of the octave, because the octave is subdivided into 4 equal parts. Right? And that specific progression is a hallmark of the more contemporary harmonic progressions and harmonic experiments. Okay, so that's one thing. The next thing I would like to point out are some kind of neighboring harmonies. So for instance, the way the structural chords are foreshadowed. For instance, the chord on F7 in measure 5 is anticipated by a chord that is half step below, E7 of dominant quality. So now we have that kind of motion from the leading tone. So leading tone E, and it creates very parsimonious voice leading. So lower chromatic neighbor anticipating the structural harmonies. And it happens in other places as well. For instance, in measure 7, the C7 chord is also anticipated with a B7 chord, lower neighbor, right? There are also instances of the tritone substitutions. For instance, one way of explaining the function of the E flat 7 chord in measure 2 is to think about that chord in terms of tritone substitutions. So its tritone substitutions would have been A7, and then you can see a nice cycle of descending fifths unfolding in a progression. A, D, G, C, going to F, right? But it's like a nice little twist. You know, instead of the atonic cycle, Henderson decided to do the kind of tritone substitution. Or another way of explaining would be to think of it as an upper diatonic, upper chromatic neighbor of D7, just to hide the obvious characteristics, right? And there's another very interesting thing. When you listen to it, the rhythmic metric distribution of these chords is not as common and as natural as we've encountered in other chord progressions. Listen to it one more time. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. So is something not quite right. So that's another very interesting twist in the metric placement of these chords. And there are another, the final thing that I want to point out is the change of chord qualities in measure 8, 9, and 10. So instead of, we have suspended chords. So this progression kind of combines the best of two worlds. We have the so-called tertian harmonies with E flat 7, D7, traditional harmonies, and we have these modal progressions, modal chords, and that marriage of modality and tonality is perfectly utilized in that chord. One more thing I wanted to mention, that even though on the surface this chord progression is highly intricate and very complicated, but one thing that stays constant with the blues are the structural chords that we've talked about in lecture 1. The structural chords that control the unfolding of individual phrases. So in measure 1 through 4, we still have that C7 that controls that is hierarchically more important than other chords. And then in measure 5, we get to our subdominant. In measure 7, we get to our tonic. And then in measure 9, if we think of it as a triton sub of D, we get our traditional chord progression. But the surface, capitalizing on equal subdivision of the octave, change of chord qualities from dominant to suspended, and these very modern chord progressions, anticipation of structural chords by minor second arrival. E7 to F, B7 to C. So let me play that progression one more time, so you can now hear that with proper theoretical understanding. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.